The moment my aunt held up the newest family portrait and joked that it was the first one that finally looked complete, the entire room exploded with laughter. Everyone except me. I stood near the dining room doorway holding a tray of drinks, smiling just enough to hide the sting I had felt for most of my life. In every framed photograph lining my grandmother's house, there was a pattern nobody talked about openly. Birthday parties, anniversaries, Christmas mornings, family reunions. Somehow I was always missing. Sometimes I had been asked to take the picture. Sometimes I had arrived too late. Sometimes they simply forgot to call me over. The excuses changed, but the result never did. That afternoon, as relatives admired the portrait and passed around stories, I noticed my grandmother sitting quietly in her favorite chair, watching everyone instead of joining them. Her expression lingered on the photograph longer than anyone else's. 3 weeks later, she was gone. The funeral was painful, but what happened afterward changed everything. Because while my family expected the lawyer to read a simple will and divide a predictable inheritance, nobody knew my grandmother had left behind 2 sealed envelopes. And when the lawyer opened the second one, the laughter that had followed me for years disappeared from every face in the room. My name is Emily, and for as long as I can remember, I occupied a strange place inside my own family. I was never openly hated, never completely excluded, and never given a dramatic reason for why I seemed to exist, just outside the circle everyone else shared. My cousins vacationed together. My brother was celebrated for every small achievement. My aunt made sure everyone knew who mattered and who didn't. Meanwhile, I became the dependable one, the person they called when they needed help moving furniture, driving someone to an appointment, organizing paperwork, or caring for grandma when everyone else was suddenly too busy. I learned early that arguing only made people label you difficult, so I stayed calm and observed. What nobody realized was that silence allows you to notice things others miss. Over the years, I saw who actually visited grandma when there was no audience. I saw who ignored her calls and who returned them. I saw which relatives loved appearing devoted and which ones quietly disappeared whenever responsibility arrived. Grandma noticed too. She never confronted anyone publicly, and neither did I. But during the final years of her life, she began asking me unusual questions about family records, old photographs, and memories that seemed insignificant at the time. I answered every question honestly. Looking back now, I realized she wasn't collecting stories. She was preparing for something. And while the rest of the family spent years deciding where I belonged, Grandma had already decided exactly where the truth belonged. The first sign that something was different came 6 months before Grandma passed away. Every Sunday, I drove across town to help her with groceries, medications, and whatever small tasks she insisted she could still manage herself. Most weeks, I was the only family member who showed up. Occasionally, my Aunt Linda would stop by for 15 minutes, usually long enough to post a photo online with a caption about cherishing family moments before leaving for some other commitment. My brother Ryan always claimed work kept him busy. My cousins promised to visit soon. Soon rarely arrived. Grandma never complained about them, but she noticed everything. One afternoon, while organizing boxes in the attic, she asked me to bring down several albums filled with family photographs. Dust covered the covers, and some of the albums dated back decades. We spent hours turning pages together. At first, it felt like a pleasant walk through family history. Then she started asking questions. "Do you remember this Christmas?" she asked, pointing to a picture where everyone stood around the tree. I remembered it clearly because I had spent most of the morning assembling toys for my younger cousins. I wasn't in the photo. A few pages later, she showed me a reunion picture. Again, everyone was present except me. Then came a birthday party. Then an anniversary celebration. Then a graduation. The pattern became impossible to ignore. Grandma didn't say much. She simply turned page after page while I quietly answered her questions. By sunset, more than 30 photographs had passed between us. In almost every one, I was missing. Finally, Grandma closed the album and looked out the window. "I should have noticed sooner," she said softly. I told her it didn't matter. The truth was, it had mattered for years, but admitting that felt pointless. She squeezed my hand and changed the subject. A week later, she called asking if I could help organize old documents stored in a filing cabinet she hadn't opened in years. The cabinet contained property records, insurance policies, handwritten letters, family correspondence, and dozens of photographs that had never been displayed. As we sorted through everything, I noticed something strange. Many of the original photographs included me. The framed versions displayed around the house often did not. In several cases, the images had been cropped. Sometimes only slightly. Sometimes dramatically. One picture from a summer picnic originally showed me sitting beside Grandma. The displayed version removed nearly half the image. Another photo from Thanksgiving had been edited so tightly that I vanished entirely. At first I assumed it was coincidence, but the examples kept appearing. Grandma's expression grew more serious with every discovery. She asked who usually handled family photo albums and framed portraits. The answer was easy: Aunt Linda. For more than 20 years, Linda had proudly managed every family scrapbook, reunion display, holiday collage, and framed collection hanging throughout relatives' homes. Grandma didn't comment further, but she began setting certain photographs aside in a separate box. During the following months, she requested my help more often. Sometimes we organized records. Sometimes we reviewed old letters. Sometimes we simply talked. She asked detailed questions about family events stretching back decades. Who attended? Who didn't? Who paid expenses? Who cared for relatives during illnesses? Who stepped forward when problems appeared? The conversations felt unusual, but I answered honestly and never pushed for explanations. Meanwhile, family gatherings continued exactly as they always had. At Ryan's 40th birthday dinner, the photographer gathered everyone together for a group shot and somehow forgot to call my name. At a 4th of July barbecue, cousins squeezed into a photo beside the lake while I carried supplies back to the house. The exclusion had become so normal that most people barely noticed it anymore. Most people, however, were not Grandma. By late autumn, her health began declining rapidly. Doctor appointments became frequent. Hospital visits followed. During those difficult months, I spent countless evenings sitting beside her bed while she rested. Other relatives visited too, but usually in short bursts. They arrived with flowers, conversations, and visible concern. Then they left. I stayed. One night, shortly after Christmas, Grandma reached into her bedside drawer and handed me a small key. She told me it opened a locked box stored in her study and instructed me not to use it unless something happened to her. Before I could ask why, she smiled and changed the subject. At the time, I assumed it was simply one more responsibility she trusted me with. I had no idea that key would eventually unlock the secret that changed everything my family believed about itself. Grandma passed away on a quiet Tuesday morning in February. The hospital called just after sunrise, and for several minutes I sat in my car outside my apartment, unable to start the engine. No matter how prepared you think you are, grief arrives differently when the person who always made you feel seen is suddenly gone. The funeral brought relatives from 3 different states. Cousins I hadn't spoken to in years filled the church. Old family friends shared stories. Everyone described Grandma as generous, wise, and devoted to family. Listening to them, I realized how many people loved her and how few truly knew the life she had lived during her final years. At the reception afterward, familiar dynamics returned almost immediately. Aunt Linda positioned herself at the center of every conversation, accepting praise for helping organize the service. Ryan talked confidently about handling future family matters. Several relatives discussed Grandma's estate as though decisions had already been made. I stayed mostly quiet. The following week, the family gathered at the office of attorney Michael Harris, the lawyer who had handled Grandma's legal affairs for nearly 2 decades. The conference room was crowded with relatives expecting a routine reading of the will. Linda appeared especially confident. She had spent days telling everyone that Grandma believed family assets should remain with those who had always been most involved. The implication was obvious. She considered herself one of those people. Attorney Harris began by reviewing standard estate matters. The family home would be sold. Certain investments would be divided among designated beneficiaries. Personal belongings had already been assigned according to Grandma's instructions. Nothing sparked major controversy. Then came the first surprise. Grandma had left me ownership of her private caregiving account, a fund she had quietly maintained for years. The amount wasn't enormous, but it was substantial enough to draw visible reactions around the room. Linda immediately looked irritated. Ryan shifted in his chair. A cousin muttered something under his breath. Attorney Harris continued reading. Several additional gifts followed. To everyone's confusion, Grandma had left me responsibility for overseeing the distribution of certain family records and historical materials. The assignment sounded administrative, but it carried unusual authority. Linda finally interrupted. She asked whether there had been some mistake. Harris calmly assured her there had not. Then he paused and opened a folder separate from the main estate documents. Before her passing, he explained, Margaret provided additional instructions regarding a sealed package to be delivered after the initial reading. The room became noticeably quieter. He retrieved a large envelope and placed it on the table. Across the front, written in Grandma's unmistakable handwriting, were the words, "Open only after my will has been read completely." Linda frowned. Ryan looked confused. Harris broke the seal and removed several pages. The first document was a letter. Grandma explained that she had spent the last year reviewing family records because she wanted future generations to understand the difference between appearances and actions. Several relatives exchanged uncomfortable glances. Then Harris revealed the next item. A collection of photographs. Not copies. Originals. He began placing them across the conference table. At first, nobody understood what made them important. Then the pattern emerged. Every photo showed a familiar family event. Christmas gatherings. Birthdays. Reunions. Graduations. The original versions included me. Beside each original photograph sat the edited or cropped version displayed throughout the family over the years. The differences were impossible to ignore. In some cases, entire sections had been removed. In others, framing choices conveniently excluded me while preserving everyone else. The room fell silent. Linda's face lost color. One cousin picked up a photograph and stared at it in disbelief. Harris continued reading from Grandma's letter. She explained how she discovered the alterations while reviewing archived materials. She described spending months comparing originals against public displays. Most importantly, she documented who had maintained exclusive control over those photographs for decades. Linda attempted to speak, but Harris wasn't finished. Attached to the photographs were receipts from photo processing services, scrapbook orders, custom framing requests, and restoration work dating back years. Every receipt listed the same customer name. Linda. Nobody accused her directly. The evidence spoke for itself. Yet Grandma's letter wasn't focused on punishment. It focused on recognition. She wrote that exclusion rarely begins with dramatic acts. It grows through hundreds of small decisions repeated over time until they become accepted as normal. She admitted she had failed to notice the pattern sooner and expressed deep regret for that failure. Then Harris reached the final page of the letter. That's when he announced that Grandma had also left specific instructions regarding a second sealed envelope, one that would not be opened until everyone present had reviewed the photographs completely. The room grew so quiet that even the sound of paper being turned seemed loud. And for the first time in my life, every member of my family was looking directly at something they had spent years refusing to see. Nobody spoke for nearly a full minute after the last photograph was passed around the table. The silence felt heavier than any argument could have. Some relatives stared at the images. Others avoided eye contact entirely. Aunt Linda sat rigidly in her chair, her hands clasped so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Ryan looked genuinely unsettled, as if he were replaying years of memories and realizing how much he had overlooked. Attorney Harris allowed the room to absorb what they had seen before reaching for the second envelope. Unlike the first, this one was smaller and marked with a single handwritten sentence from Grandma, "Actions leave records." He opened it carefully and removed another stack of documents. What followed surprised even me. Grandma had spent the final year of her life documenting far more than photographs. The first pages contained visitor logs from her assisted living facility and hospital stays. Every visit had been recorded by reception staff. Dates, times, names, and duration of visits were all documented. Harris began reading summaries aloud. During the previous 3 years, I had signed into the facility more than 400 times. The next highest family member had visited fewer than 40 times. Several relatives shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Linda immediately argued that visit counts didn't measure love. Harris agreed and calmly moved to the next records. Phone logs. Grandma had requested copies from her service provider because she often struggled to remember who called. The records showed hundreds of outgoing and incoming conversations between us. They also revealed months-long gaps where some relatives never contacted her at all. Then came transportation receipts, medical appointment records, pharmacy pickup authorizations, emergency contact forms. Every document told the same story. Not a dramatic story. Not a heroic one. Just years of consistent responsibility that nobody had bothered to notice because it happened quietly. I felt embarrassed more than proud. I had never helped Grandma expecting recognition. The attention made me uncomfortable. But the room was beginning to understand something that couldn't be dismissed as opinion anymore. The evidence wasn't proving I was perfect. It was proving that reality looked very different from the family narrative many people had accepted. Then Harris reached the section that changed everything. Grandma had written a personal statement explaining why she investigated family records in the first place. It started with a memory. Several months earlier, she had overheard relatives discussing me during a family gathering. They believed she was asleep in another room. One person called me selfish. Another claimed I only visited because I expected an inheritance. Someone joked that I had always been desperate for family approval. Grandma never identified who said what. She wrote that names no longer mattered. What mattered was that every accusation contradicted years of documented facts. Instead of confronting anyone immediately, she began collecting information. She wanted certainty before speaking. What she discovered disturbed her deeply. The exclusion from photographs was only the most visible example. She found old event invitations sent without my name. Family group messages that intentionally left me out. Vacation plans discussed around me but never shared with me. Holiday gatherings where everyone else received updated schedules except me. None of the incidents seemed devastating individually. Together, however, they formed a pattern stretching across nearly 15 years. The room remained silent as Harris read. Nobody attempted to defend the behavior because nobody could honestly deny it. Then he revealed the final portion of Grandma's instructions. Months before her death, she had created a private trust containing a significant portion of her remaining investments. The trust would not be divided equally. Audible gasps filled the room. Linda sat forward immediately. Ryan's eyes widened. Several cousins exchanged nervous glances. But the trust wasn't structured around favoritism. It was structured around responsibility. Grandma had directed that the trust fund support family members facing future educational, medical, or financial emergencies. However, administration of the trust belonged solely to one person. Me. I wouldn't own the money personally. I would oversee how it was distributed according to rules Grandma had established. The decision stunned everyone. Linda looked furious. "You're giving her control over all of us," she demanded. Harris corrected her. Margaret made that decision herself. Then he read one final passage from the letter. Grandma wrote that leadership is not measured by who speaks the loudest at family dinners, appears in the most photographs, or receives the most attention. Leadership is measured by who quietly shows up when nobody is watching. The words seemed to drain the remaining confidence from several people in the room. For years, I had occupied the edge of every family picture. Now, for the first time, everyone was being forced to confront why. Yet the biggest shock wasn't the trust itself. It was what Harris revealed next. Because before creating the trust, Grandma had hired someone to investigate how those years of exclusion had started in the first place. And according to the report sitting in front of him, The answer traced back to a single decision made nearly 2 decades earlier by someone sitting in that very room. The moment Attorney Harris mentioned an investigation report, every eye in the room shifted toward him. Even Linda's anger seemed to pause. He opened a final folder and explained that Grandma had hired an independent family records researcher approximately 10 months before her death. The assignment was simple: determine when the pattern of exclusion began and whether it happened accidentally or intentionally. According to the report, the earliest evidence appeared 19 years earlier, shortly after my father died. I was 11 years old. Until then, family photographs showed me everywhere. Birthday parties, holidays, summer trips, school events. The change was sudden. Within a year of Dad's death, invitations became less frequent, group photos started excluding me, and relatives gradually stopped treating me as part of the family's inner circle. The report documented dozens of examples. What shocked everyone wasn't the timeline, it was the reason behind it. Shortly after Dad passed away, a disagreement erupted over financial support my grandmother wanted to provide for me and my education. Several adults in the family believed those resources should be distributed more broadly among grandchildren. Arguments followed. Resentment grew. Eventually, one influential relative began portraying me as distant, ungrateful, and uninterested in family relationships. The narrative spread quietly over the years until people accepted it as truth. Nobody questioned it because nobody examined the facts. Harris paused before reading the next section. According to witness statements collected from old family friends and relatives who were no longer living, the person most responsible for shaping that narrative was Linda. The room froze. Linda immediately denied everything. She accused the report of being biased. She claimed memories were unreliable. She insisted she had always acted in the family's best interests. But then Harris presented something she couldn't explain away: handwritten correspondence. Nearly 20 years earlier, Linda had exchanged letters with another relative discussing concerns that Grandma spent too much attention on me after Dad's death. One sentence stood out. Linda wrote that if people stopped viewing me as special, things would eventually balance themselves out. Nobody said a word. Ryan looked physically sick. Several cousins stared at Linda as though they were seeing her for the first time. The woman who had spent years presenting herself as the guardian of family unity suddenly appeared very different. Yet Grandma's final message wasn't focused on revenge. In fact, her closing instructions surprised everyone. She directed that no family member be removed from the trust. No inheritance would be revoked. No one would be publicly punished. Instead, she ordered that every document, photograph, letter, and report be preserved together in a permanent family archive available to future generations. Truth is consequence enough, she wrote. People can survive mistakes. Families cannot survive lies disguised as history. Attorney Harris folded the final page and closed the folder. The meeting ended shortly afterward, but nobody rushed toward the door. Conversations that once felt effortless had become difficult. Excuses sounded hollow. Defensiveness felt pointless. One by one, relatives approached me. Some apologized directly. Others admitted they never noticed what was happening. A few simply looked ashamed. Ryan was the last. He sat beside me after most people had left and quietly admitted that he had spent years accepting assumptions instead of paying attention. It wasn't a dramatic movie speech. It was honest. For the first time in a long time, honesty felt more valuable than apology. Linda left without speaking to me. Over the following months, family dynamics changed in ways I never expected. The trust became active, and several relatives eventually needed assistance through it. Every request followed Grandma's guidelines. No favoritism. No grudges. No revenge. Just fairness. Ironically, some of the same people who had once excluded me found themselves relying on decisions I was responsible for making. I treated every request professionally and respectfully, exactly as Grandma would have wanted. A year later, during our first large family reunion after her passing, someone organized a group photograph. Old habits almost repeated themselves when people began arranging positions. Then Ryan stopped everyone and called me to the center. Nobody argued. Nobody forgot. Nobody looked away. As the camera flashed, I realized something important. The inheritance wasn't the trust. It wasn't the investments. It wasn't the authority Grandma left behind. The real inheritance was the truth. For nearly 2 decades, people had edited me out of the family story. Grandma's final gift was making sure that never happened again. When I look back now, the part that stays with me isn't the lawyer opening the second envelope or the stunned expressions around that conference table. It isn't the trust, the documents, or even the apologies that followed. It's the realization that truth has a quiet way of waiting for its moment. For years, I thought being left out of those photographs meant I didn't belong. I thought maybe if I worked harder, helped more, or stayed even quieter, things would eventually change. But Grandma taught me something far more valuable. The people who truly see your worth don't need to be convinced. They notice your actions long before anyone else does. In the end, I never exposed anyone. I never demanded justice. I never fought for attention. I simply kept showing up. And when the truth finally surfaced, it spoke louder than I ever could have. Today, the family archive Grandma created still exists, and every new photograph gets added exactly as it was taken, no cropping, no editing, and no rewriting history. Maybe that's the kind of legacy that matters most. If you've ever been underestimated, excluded, or made to feel invisible by people who should have known better, remember this: sometimes the strongest response isn't proving them wrong. It's letting time reveal who was right all along. If this story resonated with you, like, subscribe, and share your thoughts below. I read every comment.